Just shot in self-defense, boom, boom, boom. They weren't cut up, they weren't sliced up, no OJ jazz. And he said, I did the most horrendous crime in the whole wide world.
Florida isn't just home to sun-soaked beaches and theme parks. It also houses some of the most dangerous and manipulative women in American criminal history. Behind the bars of prisons like Lowell Correctional and Homestead lie tales of betrayal, greed, vengeance, and pure evil. Aileen Wuornos lured men off the highways and executed them with cold precision. Judy Buenoano poisoned her own family for insurance money, earning the nickname the Black Widow. And Jennifer Mee, the girl once famous for uncontrollable hiccups, now serves life for orchestrating a brutal murder. These aren't just crimes. They're shocking betrayals by women who were mothers, daughters, lovers, and murderers. From the woman who zipped her boyfriend into a suitcase and filmed his final moments, to a teenage girl who helped kill her own father. Each name on this list shattered every moral boundary and left behind a legacy of horror that Florida will never forget. What drives a woman to commit such monstrous acts? How did they get caught? And what did the courts decide? Some were sentenced to life, others to death. One even escaped and made the FBI's 10 most wanted. This is part 1 of our journey into the darkest corners of Florida's prison system. Stay tuned, because the stories you're about to hear are not just disturbing, they're unforgettable.
We were sitting on the floor watching TV, and she just come out and said, I have something to tell you. And I asked her what, and she said that she had shot and killed a man that day.
That's right, that's why I don't care if I'm executed and leave this planet.
You were just born bad. How do
Boy,
you...
I don't know about you. I'm telling you, man. No, I wasn't born bad. You guys got it. See, I'm trying to tell you, man, they lied. They lied so bad to you, all. All they were was shot and left.
Case 1. Aileen Wuornos. In the humid stretches of central Florida, where highways slice through rural towns and truck stops blend into the horizon, a woman was leaving a trail of bodies and confusion. Her name was Aileen Wuornos, a name that would soon become synonymous with fear, controversy, and one of the most debated criminal cases in American history. But Aileen's story didn't begin with violence. It began in pain, abandonment, and the margins of society where few ever find a path out. Born in 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, Aileen never met her father. He was in prison for child molestation when she was born and later died by suicide. Her mother abandoned her at the age of 4, leaving Aileen and her brother with their grandparents, who, by some accounts, were abusive and neglectful. From a young age, Aileen was forced to navigate a world without safety or structure. By her early teens, she was engaging in survival sex, trading her body for food, money, and a place to sleep. She was homeless, pregnant at 14, and eventually expelled from her home. That instability shaped her perception of trust, power, and danger, elements that would later fuel a deadly narrative. By the late 1980s, Wuornos had drifted south, making her way to Florida, working as a highway prostitute. She often frequented bars, hitchhiked, and engaged with men who offered rides, drinks, or money. But in 1989, a transformation occurred. Over the span of a year, she murdered 7 men across multiple Florida counties. Each of them had picked her up, each encounter turned fatal. Wuornos later claimed that at least some of the men had attempted to assault her, and that she acted in self-defense. Yet investigators found inconsistencies in her statements, and her pattern of behavior suggested something more complicated, perhaps premeditated, perhaps driven by a deeper rage she could no longer contain. The investigation into the killings revealed a tangled web of identities, stolen cars, and ballistic matches. Law enforcement began connecting the dots after Richard Mallory's body was found shot multiple times. His car was discovered abandoned, and fingerprints lifted from the vehicle eventually led authorities to Wuornos. A nationwide bulletin went out with a sketch of 2 women seen driving a victim's car, Wuornos and her then-girlfriend, Tyria Moore. When police finally closed in, they arrested Wuornos at a biker bar in Volusia County in January 1991. What followed was not just a criminal case, but a cultural spectacle. The legal proceedings drew intense media scrutiny. prosecutors charged Wuornos with multiple counts of first-degree murder, seeking the death penalty. The trial for Richard Mallory's murder was the first to go to court. During the trial, the prosecution argued that the crime was cold-blooded and calculated. They emphasized that Wuornos had stolen Mallory's car and belongings, pointing to financial motive rather than self-defense. The defense team attempted to introduce her history of trauma and abuse as context for her actions, but much of that was excluded during the early stages of the legal proceedings. The courtroom was a study in contrast. On one side, a woman painted as a predator who lured men to their deaths. On the other, a damaged soul shaped by abandonment, sexual violence, and untreated mental illness. Wuornos's psychological profile became a subject of national debate. Some forensic psychiatrists suggested she suffered from borderline personality disorder, while others suspected post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from her years of abuse and instability. Still, the court was focused on the evidence, and ultimately, the jury took only a few hours to convict her. During her sentencing hearing, Wuornos made no attempt to plead for mercy. Instead, she lashed out at the system and the media. She would later plead guilty to several other murders, often changing her story about the events. At times, she maintained that all the killings were in self-defense. At other moments, she described them as necessary, preemptive strikes against men she believed were going to harm her. These conflicting narratives fueled further psychological interest in her case. Was she a victim of lifelong trauma acting out of survival? Or was she a remorseless predator fueled by rage and delusion? The Florida criminal justice system ultimately sentenced Wuornos to death. She spent over a decade on death row at the Florida Department of Corrections' Lowell Correctional Institution for Women. During this time, she gave several interviews, many of which added to the controversy surrounding her mental state. Some close to the case believed she had deteriorated significantly. In her final interviews, Wuornos made erratic statements and expressed paranoid beliefs that the prison staff was poisoning her food and that the government was using her for experimentation. Despite questions about her competency, the execution went forward. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She declined a last meal and instead asked for a simple cup of coffee. Her final words were brief, bizarre, and cryptic. "I'll be back, like Independence Day, with Jesus, June 6, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." Her death did not end the debate. The Wuornos case raised lasting questions about how the legal system treats women with histories of severe trauma and mental illness. Some activists and legal scholars questioned whether she had received fair treatment under the law, or if her portrayal as a female serial killer overshadowed a necessary exploration of her mental health and the abuse she endured. Others argued that her crimes showed clear evidence of planning and violence beyond self-preservation, warranting the harshest penalty available. Her story has since been the subject of documentaries, books, and the Oscar-winning film Monster, which examined the events leading up to her arrest through a sympathetic lens. But no dramatization can fully capture the complexity of Wuornos's life. A life marked by pain, poverty, and a final descent into violence. The Wuornos case exposed the danger of unmonitored interstate travel, the vulnerability of marginalized sex workers, and the challenges in balancing justice with compassion. It also highlighted flaws in how the system screens for mental instability before enforcing capital punishment. Today, Aileen Wuornos remains one of the most controversial figures in Florida's criminal history, a woman whose crimes were horrific, but whose life story forces an uncomfortable question. What happens when a lifetime of suffering goes unanswered? In seeking to punish the crimes, did the system overlook the warning signs that might have prevented them? The case of Aileen Wuornos is more than a headline. It is a study in trauma, justice, and the unpredictable ways human psychology can unravel when left untreated. Her legacy is not one of sympathy or absolution, but of caution. A reminder that behind some of the most twisted crimes in history lie human beings shaped by darkness, long before they ever picked up a weapon. Case 2. Christine Falling. In the quiet towns of northern Florida, where neighbors still wave across porches and children ride bicycles under the sun, a series of unexpected tragedies once tore through the fabric of trust that holds any community together. The pattern was subtle at first. An infant dead in a crib, a toddler collapsing during nap time, another child suffering a sudden, unexplained seizure. Few suspected that the cause of these deaths wasn't illness or fate, but a teenage girl with a disturbing secret. Her name was Christine Falling, and by the time the truth unraveled, 6 children had lost their lives. Born in 1963 in Perry, Florida, Christine Laverne Slaughter, later known as Christine Falling, grew up in an environment shaped by instability and neglect. The youngest of several children, she was placed in and out of foster homes, reportedly suffering from developmental delays and frequent episodes of emotional dysregulation. By her early teens, she exhibited alarming behavior, violent outbursts, compulsive lying, and an eerie obsession with animals, particularly in how they died. Reports suggest she would often kill cats by throwing them to their deaths, later telling people she believed they had special powers. These incidents, while disturbing, were largely dismissed or misunderstood at the time, viewed as acts of a troubled child rather than the early signs of something far more dangerous. At the age of 17, Christine married a man twice her age, but the marriage lasted less than 6 weeks. By then, she had already been in and out of psychiatric care, briefly institutionalized for bizarre hallucinations and suicidal ideation. Yet despite these early warning signs, Christine found a way to blend into daily life, taking on babysitting jobs around Blountstown, Perry, and Lakeland, where she was known to families as quiet, simple, and seemingly harmless. In reality, Christine was harboring an inner storm she couldn't control and a craving for attention that found expression in the most tragic of ways. Between 1980 and 1982, 6 young children died under Christine's care. Each time, the symptoms seemed sudden and mysterious: convulsions, unconsciousness, respiratory failure. Medical professionals often ruled the deaths as natural or undetermined, with no visible trauma. These conclusions allowed Christine to continue moving between families and towns without much suspicion. But eventually, the pattern became too consistent to ignore. After the death of a 4-year-old girl named Cassidy Johnson in July 1982, an autopsy revealed signs of suffocation. Authorities reopened prior investigations and began reviewing every case tied to Falling. The turning point in the investigation came when detectives noticed that Christine had been the only adult present during all 6 deaths, with each child in good health beforehand. When questioned, Christine initially denied wrongdoing. But during a follow-up interrogation, she broke down and confessed to the murders, claiming that voices told her to kill the children. She said she was overwhelmed when the babies cried or wouldn't sleep and believed she was protecting them from suffering. Investigators struggled to make sense of her reasoning, but the consistency of her confessions, along with toxicology reports and forensic findings, confirmed a deeply troubling truth. The case now demanded not only legal consequences, but also psychological analysis into the mind of a young woman shaped by trauma, mental illness, and a society that failed to intervene. Christine Falling's psychological profile became central to her legal proceedings. Experts concluded she suffered from multiple mental health disorders, including borderline intellectual functioning and possible schizophrenia. She displayed a limited grasp of reality, impulsivity, and a lack of empathy. Her background, marked by abandonment, failed institutional support, and untreated mental illness, painted the portrait of a person who had fallen through every safety net. And yet, the legal system faced a difficult question. Should her mental condition mitigate her responsibility, or had she proven herself fully aware of the harm she caused? In a 1982 courtroom in Polk County, Florida, Christine was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder. Facing the death penalty, she agreed to a plea deal in which she would plead guilty in exchange for 6 life sentences without parole. During her sentencing hearing, the court heard disturbing details from her trial testimony. Despite her youth, only 19 years old at the time, she had demonstrated a pattern of behavior consistent with someone capable of calculated, repeated homicide. Her mental health diagnoses did not absolve her in the eyes of the court, but did raise important questions about early intervention and how communities respond to red flags in adolescent behavior. Christine Falling's imprisonment began at the Lowell Correctional Institution in Florida, where she remains to this day. Over the years, her case has been studied in criminal justice and forensic psychology programs as a rare example of a female serial killer whose victims were exclusively children. Her story stands as an anomaly in crime statistics. Female serial offenders are rare, and those who target children even more so. But beyond the headlines and courtroom drama lies a deeper public safety issue. The need to improve systems that monitor and treat youth with severe behavioral and emotional disturbances. The Falling case triggered policy conversations in Florida about how babysitters are vetted, how child deaths are investigated, and how mental health records are shared across institutions. It exposed the lack of coordination between healthcare, law enforcement, and social services. In Christine's case, multiple warning signs, animal cruelty, psychiatric episodes, unstable housing had been documented but never connected in a way that could have prevented these tragedies. Her life is a haunting example of how overlooked mental illness can evolve into something catastrophic when left unchecked. The lessons drawn from her crimes continue to resonate today. The importance of comprehensive background checks for child care providers, better mental health screening for juveniles, and earlier psychiatric intervention are just a few of the policy recommendations that arose in the wake of her trial. Many professionals argue that if Christine Falling had received consistent psychiatric care or been placed in a long-term therapeutic environment, lives could have been saved. But hindsight offers cold comfort to the families who lost their children. Now in her 60s, Christine Falling remains largely out of the public eye. Rarely granting interviews, she serves her sentence in a correctional facility that houses some of Florida's most infamous female inmates. But her legacy is not forgotten. It lives on in textbooks, documentaries, and policy reforms inspired by the deep psychological undercurrents of her crimes. She remains a disturbing reminder that danger doesn't always wear a mask. It sometimes arrives in the form of a teenage girl with pigtails and a babysitter's smile. Ultimately, the case of Christine Falling is not just a tale of horror. It is a cautionary study in how neglect, untreated mental illness, and systemic failure can culminate in tragedy. It forces a society to look beyond the crime and examine the foundation that allowed it to happen. In doing so, it challenges the justice system to be more than reactive. It demands a commitment to early detection, comprehensive care, and accountability, both for those who commit crimes and for the systems tasked with preventing them. Case 3. Judy Buenoano. In the dark tapestry of Florida's criminal history, few names stand out like Judy Buenoano. To those who knew her casually, she was a quiet, composed woman, a mother, a nurse, and a widow. But to investigators and prosecutors, she would come to be known by a far more sinister name, the Black Widow. Her story is one of manipulation, methodical planning, and a chilling absence of remorse. What began as isolated tragedies, an accidental death, a mysterious illness, would eventually be exposed as a pattern of calculated murder, all orchestrated for financial gain. Born Judy Buenoano in Texas in 1943, Judy's early life was marked by abandonment and abuse. Her mother died when she was very young, and her father, reportedly strict and emotionally distant, sent her to reform school during her teenage years. She later claimed she had been a victim of both physical and emotional trauma throughout her childhood. These early experiences may have shaped the psychological patterns she would later exhibit: control, detachment, and a deep desire to mask vulnerability with dominance. By the 1970s, Judy was living in Pensacola, Florida, with her common-law husband, James Goodyear, an Air Force sergeant and Vietnam veteran. He was in good health when he suddenly became severely ill in 1971. Doctors were puzzled by his rapid decline, but no foul play was suspected. James died not long after his symptoms began. Judy quickly collected the life insurance policies, one of which she had recently taken out, and went on with her life. At the time, no one questioned the death of a war veteran who had endured harsh conditions overseas. But behind the grieving widow facade was a woman who had just orchestrated her first successful murder for profit. Over the next decade, Judy's life followed a pattern that now appears almost chillingly predictable. In 1978, her teenage son, Michael, became mysteriously ill. He began to lose the use of his limbs and was later diagnosed with paraplegia. Doctors believed it was a rare neurological disorder, but they could not explain the rapid onset. In 1980, Judy took Michael canoeing on a river near their home. The boat capsized and Michael, unable to swim due to his paralysis, drowned. Once again, Judy collected insurance money. 2 deaths, both close family members, both financially beneficial. The circumstances seemed tragic, but not criminal, until another man in her life met a similar fate. In 1983, her boyfriend, John Gentry, began experiencing unexplained illness. Judy told him he needed vitamin pills and prepared special capsules for him daily. He took them dutifully, unaware they were laced with arsenic. When Gentry was later involved in a suspicious car explosion, an incident police believed was intended to finish what the poison had started, he miraculously survived. His survival would prove pivotal. Under questioning, Gentry revealed the odd pills and Judy's sudden encouragement of new insurance policies. Investigators began to piece together a disturbing timeline. The investigation that followed was extensive. Law enforcement exhumed the bodies of James Goodyear and Michael Buenoano. Toxicology reports revealed arsenic in both remains, lethal doses. Authorities now had enough evidence to move forward. Judy was arrested in 1983 and eventually charged with multiple counts, including first-degree murder and attempted murder. During the legal proceedings, prosecutors argued that Judy exhibited a clear pattern. She ingratiated herself into close relationships, took out large insurance policies, and then eliminated those individuals once she was assured of financial gain. The psychological profile developed during her trial was chilling. Experts described her as highly manipulative, emotionally detached, and lacking empathy. She maintained a calm demeanor throughout her legal ordeal, showing little visible remorse. Witnesses, including former friends and neighbors, described her as secretive, cold, and sometimes controlling. What stood out most was her ability to function in society without raising alarm. She was a nurse, a mother, and a seemingly responsible member of the community. But beneath that carefully crafted surface lay a pattern of homicidal opportunism. During her trial testimony, prosecutors presented the financial records, insurance documents, and medical findings that built a powerful narrative of greed-driven murder. Defense attorneys tried to introduce Judy's troubled upbringing and mental health history, suggesting her actions were influenced by deep-rooted trauma. However, the court found the overwhelming evidence too compelling to ignore. She was convicted in 1984 of the murder of her son Michael, and later convicted in separate trials for the murders of James Goodyear and the attempted murder of John Gentry. Judy received a life sentence for the murder of her husband and a death sentence for the murder of her son. In 1998, after years of appeals and legal reviews, the state of Florida carried out her execution by electrocution. She was the first woman executed in the state since 1848, and one of the few women in U.S. history to face capital punishment in the modern era. Her final meal was a simple plate of broccoli, asparagus, strawberries, and hot tea. She declined to make a final statement. Her sentencing hearing and subsequent execution reignited debates across the country about capital punishment, especially in cases involving women. Some argued that her death was justified, a necessary outcome for someone who had betrayed the most sacred bonds of family and motherhood. Others questioned whether her execution reflected a broader inconsistency in how the justice system treats female offenders, particularly those with histories of abuse and mental illness. The legal proceedings in her case also highlighted the importance of forensic science, particularly toxicology, in solving crimes that otherwise leave no physical evidence. The Judy Buenoano case continues to be studied not just as a sequence of murders, but as a psychological study in manipulation, cold logic, and the failure of surface appearances. Her ability to hide in plain sight, presenting as a caregiver while quietly orchestrating death, remains one of the most haunting aspects of her story. It forced a reckoning with assumptions about who is capable of calculated violence and how easily financial incentives can twist moral boundaries. Public safety takeaways from this case have influenced insurance policy verification, forensic toxicology protocols, and increased scrutiny of caregivers in suspicious deaths. It also served as a reminder that psychological evaluations and early behavioral interventions are crucial when identifying individuals at risk of committing repeat offenses. Judy's crimes were not acts of passion or impulsive rage. They were premeditated, systematic, and chillingly indifferent. In the end, Judy Buenoano will be remembered not only for the lives she took, but for the cold precision with which she carried out her plans. Her legacy lives in courtroom transcripts, investigative documentaries, and law enforcement textbooks. A stark warning of what can happen when personal trauma, unchecked pathology, and financial desperation converge into something lethal. Case 4. Julie Schenecker. In January 2011, a tragedy unfolded behind the closed doors of a quiet suburban home in Tampa, Florida. A tragedy so unexpected, so deeply unsettling, that it would shake even the most seasoned investigators. Julie Schenecker, a former Army linguist and stay-at-home mother, was arrested for the cold and deliberate killing of her 2 teenage children. What began as a routine welfare check swiftly became one of the most haunting familial homicide cases in Florida's modern history. But beyond the crime itself lay deeper questions about untreated mental illness, the silence of suburban suffering, and a justice system forced to confront the intersection between madness and murder. Julie Schenecker had once appeared to lead a structured, even admirable life. She served in U.S. Army intelligence as a Russian linguist, and later devoted herself full-time to raising her children, while her husband, Parker Schenecker, continued his military career as a colonel stationed overseas. To outsiders, their family seemed disciplined, loving, and committed to service. But beneath that image, Julie was battling mental health struggles that would go largely unaddressed until it was too late. In the years leading up to the tragedy, Julie exhibited signs of severe psychological instability. She was reportedly on a complex regimen of medications to treat depression and bipolar disorder. Her mental health challenges were known to her family and her doctors, yet the true depth of her deterioration remained largely concealed from the public, and crucially, from law enforcement or social services. It was within this invisible world, one where mental illness quietly deepened in the background of family life, that the seeds of the crime were planted. On January 27, 2011, Tampa police arrived at the Schenecker home after Julie's mother, visiting from Texas, called to report that she hadn't heard from her daughter and was concerned for the safety of the children. Officers entered the residence and discovered a scene of profound horror. Julie, disoriented and heavily sedated, confessed to killing her 16-year-old daughter Calix and 13-year-old son Bo. Her explanation was disturbing in its simplicity. The children, she said, had been mouthing off and talking back. She wanted to put a stop to the talking. Investigators found a handwritten note on the counter, a sort of manifesto, detailing her plan and rationale. The investigation quickly shifted from determining what happened to understanding why. As detectives pieced together the timeline, they uncovered months of mental health deterioration. Julie had been in and out of psychiatric care, had undergone medication adjustments, and had become increasingly isolated. Friends and neighbors described her as withdrawn, sometimes disoriented, but never violent. Her husband, deployed in the Middle East at the time of the killings, had raised concerns about her well-being, but had not anticipated such an outcome. The legal proceedings began under intense media scrutiny. Prosecutors charged Judy Schenecker with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The state pursued a life sentence without parole, foregoing the death penalty. Her defense attorneys prepared to argue insanity, a rare but powerful strategy requiring significant psychological testimony. Central to the defense was the claim that Judy, at the time of the killings, was suffering from a severe mental disease that rendered her incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. During the trial, which took place in 2014, the courtroom became a battleground between 2 interpretations of Judy's mind. Prosecutors painted her as methodical and calculated, emphasizing the detailed planning evident in her handwritten notes, the purchase of the weapon days in advance, and the precise nature of the shootings. They argued that despite her diagnosis, she understood the consequences of her actions and took deliberate steps to carry them out. The prosecution's case hinged on the belief that mental illness alone does not absolve one of responsibility, especially when the actions are premeditated. The defense, on the other hand, presented a psychological profile of a woman in profound mental crisis. Forensic psychiatrists testified that Judy had been struggling with bipolar disorder, depression, and possible psychosis. Her judgment, they argued, was severely impaired by delusions and emotional turmoil. She believed she was saving her children from a corrupt world and was disconnected from reality at the time of the murders. Her psychiatric history included multiple prescriptions, prior hospitalizations, and alarming behavior that, in retrospect, signaled a complete psychological collapse. During trial testimony, the jury listened to expert witnesses from both sides. The debate over her mental state was intense, complex, and ultimately came down to the legal definition of insanity in Florida. Whether the defendant knew her actions were wrong at the time of the crime. Despite evidence of long-term psychiatric instability, the jury was unconvinced that Judy met the threshold for legal insanity. After 2 weeks of testimony and 3 hours of deliberation, the verdict was returned. Guilty on both counts. At her sentencing hearing, Judy sat quietly as the court imposed 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. She offered no statement and showed little visible emotion. The judge emphasized the gravity of the crimes and the devastating loss experienced by the children's father, Parker, who had sat through the trial with unwavering composure. In later interviews, Parker would express a mix of sorrow, disbelief, and the hope that society could learn from the tragedy to better address untreated mental illness. Judy's imprisonment at the Lowell Correctional Institution added her name to the list of Florida women serving life for crimes that have drawn national attention. But her case stands out not just for its brutality, but for the questions it raises about the silent dangers of untreated psychological disorders. It revealed how easily mental health issues can hide in plain sight, even in families that appear stable, even among those who serve their country with distinction. The Judy Schenecker case underscores the vital role of early intervention in mental health. It challenges the criminal justice system to work more closely with psychiatric services and social welfare organizations. It also exposes the limitations of relying solely on the legal definition of insanity in determining culpability. In Judy's case, there was no doubt about her mental illness. But the court had to consider whether that illness negated her ability to understand her actions. The line between mental breakdown and criminal responsibility remains one of the most difficult issues in modern jurisprudence. Today, the Schenecker home has long since been sold, its history buried beneath new paint and different memories. But the case continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and legal scholars alike. It serves as a sobering reminder that the most shocking crimes often arise not from strangers or external threats, but from deep within the places that should feel safest. Judy Schenecker's story is not merely about a crime. It is a tragedy rooted in untreated illness, systemic failure, and the devastating consequences of silence. It is a story that forces a reckoning with how society identifies and responds to mental health crises, and how even the most disciplined lives can unravel without support, understanding, and timely intervention. Case 5. Amelia Carr. In 2009, the disappearance of 26-year-old Heather Strong from Marion County, Florida, began as a missing persons report. Tragic, but not uncommon. But the deeper law enforcement dug into Heather's life, the more twisted the story became. At the center of it stood Amelia Carr, a woman whose smiling mugshot and quiet demeanor would come to hide one of the most psychologically disturbing crimes in Florida's recent history. What began as a romantic rivalry spiraled into a murder that would ultimately land Emilia on Florida's death row, the youngest woman there at the time, and later raise critical questions about coercion, trauma, and the complex psychology of female killers. Amelia Lily Carr didn't seem destined for notoriety. Born in 1984, her early years were shaped by turbulence and instability. She was raised in a strict household, reportedly subjected to emotional and physical abuse, and was a witness to violence from a young age. Her father would later be imprisoned for the sexual abuse of Emilia's own sisters. This deeply traumatic background created a psychological foundation marked by mistrust, emotional dependency, and a fractured sense of identity. By her early 20s, Emilia had entered into a series of volatile relationships, often with controlling or abusive men, and became a mother to several children. One of those relationships would change everything. In 2008, Emilia became involved with Joshua Fulgham, a man she had dated intermittently for years. Their relationship was described by friends and family as passionate but explosive. Fulgham, meanwhile, was married to Heather Strong, a young woman with whom he shared 2 children. Although separated at times, Heather and Joshua attempted to reconcile, with Heather even filing for an injunction against Emilia due to escalating tensions. The triangle between Joshua, Emilia, and Heather was complicated, emotional, possessive, and at times violent. Emilia, who had once been engaged to Joshua herself, now found herself on the outside, watching as Heather moved back into his life and reasserted her role as his legal spouse. But the jealousy and resentment boiling beneath the surface soon turned deadly. On February 15, 2009, Heather Strong disappeared. Joshua initially claimed he had no idea where she had gone. However, within days, suspicions began to circle around both him and Emilia. The investigation gained momentum after Heather failed to show up for work and her car was found abandoned. Detectives quickly discovered that Emilia had seen Heather shortly before her disappearance. A timeline began to emerge, placing both Emilia and Joshua near the last known location of Heather on the night she vanished. The investigation uncovered a disturbing narrative. Emilia had lured Heather to a storage trailer on the property of her mother's home in Boardman, Florida, under the pretense of resolving tensions. But what happened next was anything but peaceful. Authorities alleged that Emilia and Joshua had conspired to murder Heather, motivated by custody battles, jealousy, and an obsessive desire to remove her from their lives permanently. Heather's body was found buried in a shallow grave. The cause of death was asphyxiation. It was a crime marked by betrayal, manipulation, and cruelty. Emilia was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and accessory after the fact. The legal proceedings that followed were gripping in their complexity. Prosecutors argued that Emilia had been the mastermind, calmly and deliberately planning Heather's murder and executing it with chilling resolve. They highlighted her actions in the days before and after the killing, including efforts to cover up the crime and mislead investigators. But Emilia's defense painted a different picture. One of a psychologically vulnerable woman dominated by a manipulative man whose long history of abuse had conditioned her into submission. During the trial, a detailed psychological profile of Amelia Carr was introduced. Experts described her as having post-traumatic stress disorder, stemming from years of childhood abuse and toxic relationships. She was highly suggestible, eager for approval, and emotionally dependent on men, particularly Joshua Fulgham. Some forensic psychologists argued that Emilia may not have acted alone or of her own volition, but rather under the coercive control of a dominant partner who manipulated her vulnerabilities to his advantage. While this didn't exonerate her, it opened a crucial discussion on the role of psychological trauma in shaping criminal behavior, particularly among women who have been lifelong victims of abuse. Despite these mitigating arguments, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts. At her sentencing hearing in 2011, Amelia Carr was sentenced to death, making her the youngest woman on death row in the state of Florida. The court emphasized the calculated nature of the crime and her apparent lack of remorse. Yet behind the legal outcome, debate persisted. Was Emilia a cold-blooded killer or a deeply damaged woman pushed past the brink by psychological manipulation and a lifetime of trauma? The sentencing of a woman to death is rare in Florida, and Emilia's case reignited conversations around capital punishment, particularly in relation to female offenders. Legal scholars and human rights advocates questioned whether her background had been sufficiently considered. In 2017, her death sentence was vacated following an appeal. The court ruled that her initial trial failed to adequately weigh her personal history and mental health. She was resentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The legal reversal did not erase the crime, but it did provide a framework for broader discussion. Amelia Carr's case is now studied in criminology and psychology circles as an example of how trauma, coercive relationships, and psychological dependency can intersect in violent outcomes. It forced law enforcement and the courts to examine the nuances of complicity and the fine line between victim and perpetrator. And while justice was ultimately served in the legal sense, it left lingering questions about prevention, rehabilitation, and how society addresses early signs of psychological breakdown. This case underscores the importance of monitoring domestic disputes and recognizing red flags in high-conflict relationships. Heather Strong had previously expressed fear for her safety. She had sought legal protection from Emilia, and yet those warnings went largely unheeded. The system failed to intervene decisively before the tragedy unfolded. This breakdown highlights the urgent need for stronger mechanisms in handling domestic violence threats, particularly where children are involved. Today, Amelia Carr remains incarcerated at Lowell Correctional Institution, one of Florida's largest women's prisons. She is no longer on death row, but her name is etched in Florida's legal history, a cautionary tale about the consequences of unresolved trauma, unchecked jealousy, and the blurred lines between victimhood and culpability. Her case continues to challenge easy narratives about female violence, revealing how layered and psychologically complex such crimes can be. In the end, the murder of Heather Strong was not just a singular act of violence, it was the culmination of years of emotional dysfunction, legal blind spots, and psychological fragility. Amelia Carr's descent into criminality was not born overnight. It was cultivated through a lifetime of pain, misjudgment, and misguided loyalties. Her story is a tragic lens into the cost of ignoring emotional distress until it becomes irreversible. It is a story that underscores the need for early mental health intervention, legal responsiveness to domestic threats, and a justice system that sees beyond black and white definitions of guilt. Case 6. Jennifer Mee. In 2007, Jennifer Mee became a media sensation for an unusual reason: her chronic, uncontrollable hiccups. At just 15 years old, she made appearances on national news networks, consulted doctors and therapists, and became known across the country as the Hiccup Girl. Her condition baffled experts, and her story evoked sympathy from millions. But just 2 years later, that same name would resurface in a very different context. No longer associated with a medical mystery, but with a chilling murder. Jennifer Mee, once a teenage curiosity in America's living rooms, was arrested for orchestrating the robbery and fatal shooting of a young man in St. Petersburg, Florida. The story was no longer about hiccups. It was about manipulation, motive, and the psychological unraveling of a girl who never found her footing after fame. By the time she turned 17, Jennifer's hiccups had largely faded from public view, but her life behind the scenes had grown increasingly unstable. Her family had struggled financially, and Jennifer, who never fully returned to a sense of normalcy after her media exposure, had drifted into troubled circles. Dropping out of school, she began associating with older men and eventually moved away from her mother's home. Her social media profiles reflected a shift in identity, from vulnerable teenager to someone hardened by experience. She started using different names and became involved with street-level acquaintances, eventually forming a relationship with Lamont Newton, one of the co-defendants in the crime that would define her life. On the night of October 23, 2010, 22-year-old Shannon Griffin, a young man from Pinellas County, arranged to meet Jennifer Mee. According to the investigation, Jennifer lured Shannon to a vacant home in St. Petersburg under the pretense of buying marijuana. Once there, he was ambushed by two men, Lamont Newton and Laron Rayford, who attempted to rob him. The encounter quickly escalated into violence, and Griffin was shot multiple times. He died at the scene. Jennifer was not the one who pulled the trigger, but her role in setting up the meeting placed her directly in the center of a murder investigation. The police acted quickly. Through witness statements and digital evidence, including phone records and text messages, detectives established Jennifer's involvement in the plan. During interrogation, she confessed to setting up the meeting, though she insisted she did not know the intent was to kill. Nevertheless, prosecutors charged her with first-degree murder under Florida's felony murder rule, which allows accomplices to be held equally responsible when a killing occurs during the commission of a felony. It was a legal doctrine that would ultimately seal Jennifer's fate. The trial attracted national attention. Some were stunned by the sharp contrast between the innocent girl once plagued by hiccups and the now accused murderer sitting in a courtroom. The legal proceedings raised broader questions about culpability, trauma, and the maturity of adolescent offenders. Jennifer's defense centered around her limited mental capacity, emotional vulnerability, and lack of intent. Her attorneys argued that she had been manipulated by the older men she was with and that she never anticipated the violence that would unfold. But the prosecution focused on the facts. She orchestrated the meeting, brought Shannon to the house, and was present when the robbery turned fatal. During the trial testimony, forensic experts, law enforcement officers, and witnesses detailed the timeline of events, the recovered weapon, and the communications between the co-defendants. Prosecutors presented Jennifer not as an innocent bystander, but as an active participant, someone who lured the victim to his death under false pretenses. Despite her youth and past media persona, the jury found her guilty of first-degree murder. At her sentencing hearing, Jennifer Mee was given life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her co-defendants received the same sentence. The verdict was legally sound, but it opened a flood of social and ethical debate. Should a teenager, especially one with documented cognitive limitations and a troubled history, spend the rest of her life behind bars? Could there have been room for rehabilitation? Or had her choices crossed a moral boundary too great to ignore? Psychological analysis of Jennifer Mee suggests she had long struggled with identity and stability. Her unexpected rise to fame at a young age had disrupted her developmental path. Experts noted signs of emotional immaturity, impaired judgment, and susceptibility to peer pressure. Some mental health professionals believe that her hiccup disorder was tied to neurological or psychological stress, hinting at deeper issues that may never have been fully addressed. Once the media attention faded, Jennifer was left to navigate life without the guidance or support systems necessary for someone with her vulnerabilities. Her story became a cautionary tale about how unaddressed trauma and lack of intervention can spiral into tragedy. The Jennifer Me case also prompted legal scholars to revisit the application of felony murder laws, especially in cases involving young or peripheral participants. Critics of the law argue that it can result in disproportionate sentencing, treating all co-defendants as equally culpable, regardless of their actual involvement or intent. In Jennifer's case, her role was undeniable, but was a life sentence just? The debate continues in legal circles, particularly concerning juvenile justice reform and the role of rehabilitation versus retribution. Today, Jennifer Me serves her sentence at the Lowell Correctional Institution in Florida, a facility that houses many of the state's most infamous female inmates. She has granted a few interviews from behind bars, often reflecting on the choices that led her there. She has expressed remorse, though her appeals have so far been denied. The life she now leads bears no resemblance to the girl who once hiccuped on live television, becoming an unwitting media star. Her transformation from hiccup girl to convicted murderer is stark, but it is not without lessons. Her story forces a reckoning with how society sensationalizes vulnerability without providing support. It asks what becomes of young people thrust into the spotlight without a safety net, and what happens when trauma goes unhealed. It's a case that intertwines crime, psychology, media influence, and legal ethics, highlighting the devastating consequences when intervention comes too late. The case of Jennifer Me continues to be referenced in academic discussions, criminal justice reform efforts, and media retrospectives on crime and punishment. It is a reminder that behind many headlines lies a complex web of mental health, societal pressure, and personal decision-making. It reminds us that crime stories are rarely about monsters. They are often about broken people making catastrophic choices in a world that never gave them a chance to mend. Case 7. Sarah Boone. In the quiet suburb of Winter Park, Florida, the kind of crime that would usually seem too surreal for real life unfolded in February 2020. A case that would gain national media attention not for its complexity, but for its deeply unsettling strangeness. Sarah Boone, a 42-year-old woman with no prior history of violent crime, was arrested and later convicted for the suffocation death of her longtime boyfriend, Jorge Torres Jr., after he was found dead inside a zipped suitcase. What initially seemed like an incomprehensible accident quickly unraveled into a chilling example of psychological volatility, toxic relationships, and the blurred line between emotional dysfunction and lethal intent. Sarah Boone and Jorge Torres were in a relationship marked by intense conflict. Court documents and prior police reports would reveal a long history of domestic disturbances between the two, incidents that involved both parties accusing each other of physical aggression. Friends and neighbors described their relationship as off and on, often volatile, but rarely suspected that such dysfunction could escalate into something fatal. Yet, it was precisely this pattern of unresolved conflict, emotional instability, and unchecked anger that ultimately culminated in tragedy. According to the official investigation, on February 24, 2020, Boone called 911 to report that her boyfriend was unresponsive. When first responders arrived, they found Jorge's body curled up inside a blue suitcase in the couple's apartment. He was already deceased. Boone initially told authorities that the two had been drinking and playing a game of hide-and-seek the night before. She claimed that Jorge had willingly climbed into the suitcase and that she had fallen asleep, forgetting he was inside. Her story seemed implausible, but it wasn't until detectives examined her phone that the full scope of the case began to shift from tragic accident to potential murder. Investigators uncovered 2 video recordings on Boone's phone, videos that would become central to the prosecution's case. In the footage, Sarah could be heard mocking Jorge as he struggled inside the zipped suitcase. His voice is faint and panicked, asking repeatedly to be let out. Boone's voice responds with words that prosecutors later argued showed clear intent and a disturbing lack of empathy. She accused him of cheating, mocked his fear, and implied that this was what he deserved. These recordings became a psychological window into a moment of power imbalance and cruelty that few could reconcile with the woman's initial claim of forgetfulness. As the legal proceedings unfolded, the defense sought to paint Sarah Boone as a woman overwhelmed by years of emotional abuse, who had snapped under pressure. Her attorneys pointed to her psychological profile, which included depression, anxiety, and symptoms consistent with emotional trauma. The defense did not deny that Jorge had died inside the suitcase, but they challenged the idea that Boone had set out to kill him. Instead, they argued it was an act fueled by impulsivity, intoxication, and long-term relationship dysfunction. But the prosecution leaned heavily on the videos, arguing that they showed not just neglect, but calculated malice. In court, the trial testimony drew a complex picture of both individuals. Jorge Torres had his own troubled history, including past arrests and allegations of violence. But none of his past actions, the state argued, justified his death. The focus returned repeatedly to Boone's behavior during and after the incident. The video evidence, the delayed 911 call, and the inconsistencies in her initial statements to investigators. The prosecution emphasized her lack of immediate concern, her decision to record the suffering instead of stopping it, and her refusal to accept responsibility even when confronted with undeniable evidence. Psychological experts were brought in to assess Boone's mental state. They described a pattern of passive-aggressive behavior, emotional instability, and possible traits of narcissistic personality disorder. She reportedly struggled with managing conflict and used avoidance and blame shifting as coping mechanisms. The suitcase incident, they suggested, may have been an extreme manifestation of her need for control during a moment of anger, an impulsive act rooted in deep emotional resentment, rather than a premeditated murder. However, the jury ultimately found that her actions showed a conscious disregard for human life. In October 2023, after a trial filled with emotional testimony and intense scrutiny, Sarah Boone was found guilty of second-degree murder. At her sentencing hearing, the court handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole. She showed little visible emotion during the sentencing. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke about the disturbing nature of the evidence, particularly the recordings, which captured not only the act, but the attitude behind it. The case closed with a sense of tragic finality, but the questions it raised about domestic violence, emotional abuse, and the criminal justice system's ability to navigate such complexity remain deeply relevant. This case also drew significant attention in legal and psychological circles for its unusual circumstances. While most domestic violence cases involve long-standing patterns of abuse that result in explosive acts of violence, this one inverted many of those assumptions. It presented a situation where both parties had histories of aggression and where emotional toxicity had become mutual, blurring the lines between victim and aggressor. It also exposed the limitations of reactive policing. Several prior domestic disturbance calls had been logged at their address, but no lasting intervention had occurred. The system responded to symptoms, not root causes. From a public safety standpoint, the Sarah Boone case serves as a sobering example of what can happen when emotional volatility goes unaddressed. It highlights the need for deeper intervention strategies in domestic disputes, approaches that go beyond arrests and restraining orders to include therapy, conflict mediation, and mental health treatment. In many ways, this was a preventable tragedy, one that unfolded slowly over time as warning signs were missed or minimized. Today, Sarah Boone remains incarcerated at Lowell Correctional Institution, the same facility that houses other notorious female inmates in Florida. Her name now joins the ranks of women whose crimes defied easy categorization, cases where emotional trauma, mental illness, and interpersonal dysfunction collided with devastating consequences. Her story is not one of a criminal mastermind, but of a woman who lost control in the most permanent ways possible. The suitcase murder, as it came to be known in headlines, will likely remain in the public consciousness not because of its brutality, but because of its strange, almost surreal nature, and the raw psychological pain it revealed. It is a story that reminds us that domestic violence is not always predictable or one-sided. Sometimes it simmers beneath the surface in quiet apartments, between two people bound together not by love, but by dysfunction neither could escape. Ultimately, the tragedy of Sarah Boone and Jorge Torres is a case study in emotional implosion. It forces society to confront how overlooked mental health issues, unresolved trauma, and toxic relationships can escalate, quietly, slowly, and fatally, into acts that defy logic but demand justice. If these stories made you question what someone is truly capable of, if they lingered in your thoughts or left you unsettled, then ask yourself this: should we go even deeper? Do you want a part 2? Let me know in the comments, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join the Mindframe True Crimes family. Every week we explore the darkest corners of human behavior, exposing the lies, unraveling the motives, and confronting the minds behind the crimes. To all my loyal subscribers and returning viewers, thank you for keeping your mind in the frame. You're the reason we continue shining a light into the world's most shadowed places. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, the mind is the most dangerous place of all. This is Mindframe True Crimes. Until next time.